What happens when an undercover CEO trades his suit for a bellboy uniform and steps into his own hotel? He expects to see the business from the ground level, but what he finds is far worse. Employees are overworked, guests are frustrated, and the manager? Completely negligent. When a receptionist collapses from exhaustion and leadership turns a blind eye, the CEO knows it's time to act. But he's not just firing people, he's about to change everything. Stay tuned to see how one undercover mission exposed the truth and transformed an entire workplace. Nathaniel Pierce had built his luxury hotel chain from the ground up, priding himself on offering impeccable service and a top-tier guest experience. Yet, lately, something had gone wrong. Complaints had been piling up from one of his flagship locations, customers reporting slow service, unclean rooms, and rude staff. But what troubled him most was the internal complaints from employees. Overworked, underpaid, and struggling under poor leadership, they described a work environment that was hostile and exhausting. Nathaniel's corporate reports told a different story. The hotel's manager, Richard Holt, insisted that the problem lay with lazy workers and demanding customers. But Nathaniel knew better than to take a manager's word without proof. He had spent years trusting middle management to handle operations, but now that trust felt misplaced. Determined to uncover the truth, Nathaniel made a bold decision. He would go undercover. Posing as a newly hired bellboy, he would see for himself what was really happening behind the scenes. If his suspicions were correct, the issue wasn't the employees, it was the leadership. Dressed in a hotel uniform, Nathaniel checked into his own business as a low-level staff member, blending in with the workers who kept the hotel running. He knew that, in order to fix the problem, he had to experience it firsthand. Whatever was going wrong, he was about to find out the hard way. And if his employees were truly being mistreated, then someone was going to be held accountable. Nathaniel arrived at the hotel's grand lobby, its marble floors gleaming under the golden chandeliers. Yet something felt off. Instead of the warm, welcoming atmosphere he had envisioned for his luxury brand, the employees moved with a strained urgency, their smiles forced, their eyes tired. He adjusted the stiff uniform of his new role as a bellboy, tugging his cap lower over his forehead. No one looked at him twice, just as planned. As he stood near the reception desk, a loud, irritated voice cut through the lobby. "You call this 5-star service? I've been waiting for 10 minutes!" A wealthy guest in a tailored suit slammed his hand on the counter, his voice dripping with entitlement. Elena Carter, the front desk receptionist, flinched, but quickly tried to smooth things over. "I sincerely apologize for the delay, sir," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion. She moved swiftly, trying to correct the issue on the screen in front of her. Nathaniel noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremble in her hands, signs of someone running on empty. Instead of stepping in to help, Richard Holt, the hotel manager, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching with indifference. He made no move to intervene, no attempt to assist his struggling employee. When Elena finally resolved the issue and the guest stormed off in a huff, Richard walked over, not to support her, but to mutter under his breath. "Try not to screw up again," he said, before walking away. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. That was the moment he knew something was very wrong here. If this was how employees were treated in plain sight, what was happening behind closed doors? He hadn't been undercover for an hour, and already the cracks in the hotel's management were painfully obvious. As the day wore on, Nathaniel moved through the hotel like a ghost, blending in among the employees who barely acknowledged his presence beyond a polite nod. He used the opportunity to observe them closely, paying attention to their interactions, their body language, and the way they carried out their duties. The cracks in the hotel's operations became more apparent with every passing hour. He spotted David Chen, a housekeeper, struggling to push a fully loaded supply cart down the hallway. The cart's wheels squeaked under the weight, and David, his uniform damp with sweat, moved with visible effort. When Nathaniel offered to help, David simply let out a tired chuckle. "You new here? You'll get used to it. Management doesn't believe in light workloads," he muttered before disappearing into one of the suites. Near the concierge desk, Sophia Reed, a seasoned employee, was locked in an exhausting conversation with a guest demanding an immediate room upgrade. She explained, with careful politeness, that there were no available suites, but the guest refused to accept her answer. Frustration flickered in her eyes, but she remained professional, even as Nathaniel could see how mentally draining it was. By the time he made his way to the kitchen, the tension was even worse. The head chef barked orders at his small, overworked team, plates clattered, and the air smelled of stress as much as it did gourmet cuisine. One of the junior kitchen staff vented under his breath about how they were always short on ingredients, but when he asked Richard Holt for additional supplies, the request was ignored to cut costs. Nathaniel also noticed the nervous glances employees exchanged whenever Richard was around. Conversations halted when he entered a room, and no one dared to question him. It was clear that fear, not respect, ruled this hotel. By mid-afternoon, the reality sank in. This wasn't a hotel with a lazy workforce, as Richard had claimed. It was a hotel full of hard-working, overburdened employees being set up to fail. They weren't the problem. Management was. Nathaniel had come looking for the truth, and he was finding it at every turn. But the real question remained, just how deep did this mismanagement go? As the hours passed, Nathaniel's initial suspicions hardened into certainty. This hotel wasn't suffering from bad employees, it was suffering from bad management. And at the center of it all was Richard Holt, a man more concerned with maintaining appearances than actually running a functional hotel. During a short break in the staff lounge, Nathaniel overheard two employees venting about their impossible workloads. "I'm sick of this," David Chen muttered as he wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his uniform. "Every single shift, we're short-staffed, and Richard just tells us to push through it." "I asked him if we could get more housekeepers," Sophia Reed added, shaking her head. "He said the corporation wouldn't approve the budget." Nathaniel stiffened at that outright lie. As the owner, he knew that no such budget request had ever been made. Richard was deliberately keeping labor costs low to make his numbers look good on paper at the expense of his exhausted staff. Minutes later, he witnessed an even worse display of negligence. A sudden pipe burst in one of the VIP suites, sending water pooling across the marble floor. The front desk scrambled to relocate guests, and maintenance rushed to contain the damage. But when a frantic employee reported the issue to Richard, the manager barely glanced up from his phone. "Just put some towels down and deal with it later," he said, waving a hand dismissively. Nathaniel's blood boiled. The sheer incompetence was staggering. Not only was Richard forcing his staff to work in impossible conditions, but now he was actively ignoring serious maintenance issues that could damage the hotel's reputation. His breaking point came when a junior waiter in the restaurant was scolded for running out of a key ingredient. "Jeff told me to ask for more supplies," the young man explained nervously. Richard rolled his eyes. "Figure it out. Make something else. I don't have time for this." Nathaniel watched as the waiter's face fell, his shoulders slumping under the weight of yet another problem no one was willing to solve. This wasn't just bad management, this was deliberate neglect. Richard wasn't running this hotel, he was squeezing every bit of work out of his employees while putting in zero effort himself. Nathaniel knew then, he had seen enough. It was time for Richard to go. But first, he had to witness just how far things would spiral before stepping in. By the time the afternoon rush hit, the hotel's front desk was a whirlwind of chaos. A long line of irritated guests stretched across the lobby, some impatiently tapping their feet, others loudly complaining about their delayed check-ins. Elena Carter stood at the reception desk, her fingers moving frantically across the keyboard as she tried to manage reservation errors, misplaced luggage requests, and endless demands. Nathaniel, still disguised as a bellboy, watched from a few feet away, seeing the exhaustion etched into her features. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembled slightly as she typed, and she blinked rapidly, a clear sign that she was struggling to stay focused. A particularly aggressive guest leaned over the counter, slamming a hand against the desk. "Is it really that hard to check me in? I've stayed in better-run motels," the man snapped, his voice rising over the crowd. Elena swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain a professional tone. I apologize for the delay, sir. I'll have your room key ready in just a moment." But as she reached for the key cards, her knees buckled. For a brief moment she tried to steady herself, gripping the edge of the desk, but her vision blurred, and then she collapsed. A gasp rippled through the lobby as she crumpled to the ground. Nathaniel rushed forward immediately, kneeling beside her. "Elena?" he called, lightly shaking her shoulder. She was conscious but barely responsive, her skin clammy and pale. "She hasn't taken a break all day," Sophia muttered under her breath, kneeling beside them. "I told her to step away for a few minutes, but Richard said we were too busy for that." Nathaniel turned, expecting Richard to be concerned, to step in, to show even the slightest bit of leadership. But instead, the hotel manager just sighed in frustration. "Someone move her to the break room," he muttered, barely sparing her a glance. "And get back to work." Nathaniel felt rage coil in his chest. That was it. If Richard wouldn't act, then Nathaniel would. He had planned to stay undercover for a few more days, but after seeing Elena collapse while Richard ignored it, Nathaniel knew the time for watching was over. Tomorrow morning, Richard Holt would no longer be hotel manager. At the end of the shift, while employees were preparing to clock out, Nathaniel made his way toward the manager's office, his disguise finally coming off. He removed the stiff bellboy cap, straightened his suit jacket, and knocked once before pushing the door open without waiting for permission. Richard Holt sat at his desk, feet propped up, scrolling through his phone. There were no reports in front of him, no signs of actual managerial work. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of pure annoyance. "If you need something, leave a note," Richard muttered, barely glancing at him. "I'm busy." Nathaniel shut the door behind him. "No, Richard, you're not busy." The manager's brow furrowed as he finally took a real look at the man in front of him. His eyes darted to Nathaniel's face, recognition slowly dawning. "Wait a minute." Richard sat up straighter, his fingers twitching. "Who the hell are you?" Nathaniel leaned forward, placing both hands on the desk. "I'm Nathaniel Pierce. I own this hotel." Richard froze. The blood drained from his face. That's not possible. The owner doesn't work as a bellboy," Nathaniel finished for him, raising an eyebrow. "And yet I did. I've been here for 2 days, watching everything, watching you." His voice hardened. "I saw the way you treat employees. I saw how you ignored maintenance issues, how you overworked your staff, how you let Elena collapse without a shred of concern. And I checked the corporate records, Richard. You never once requested additional staff." Richard swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. I was just following corporate's guidelines. We have budget constraints. Nathaniel cut him off. "No. You were cutting staff to make your numbers look better. You were running this hotel into the ground while blaming everyone but yourself." A long silence stretched between them before Nathaniel exhaled sharply. "You're fired." Richard shot up from his chair. "You can't—" "I just did," Nathaniel said coldly. He pulled out his phone and sent off a quick message. "Your termination papers will be processed by HR in the morning. Security will escort you out tonight." For a moment, Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but then, realizing there was no way out, he grabbed his things and stormed past Nathaniel, slamming the door behind him. Nathaniel let out a slow breath. One problem was handled. Now it was time to fix what Richard had broken. The employees barely noticed Nathaniel at first as he stepped out of the office. They were too accustomed to being ignored by management. But when he cleared his throat, the room fell silent. "My name is Nathaniel Pierce," he announced, his voice carrying through the break room. "I own this hotel, and as of tonight, Richard Holt is no longer your manager." For a moment, no one reacted. The words seemed too surreal to process. Then, David let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "Wait, what?" Nathaniel crossed his arms, scanning their faces. "I went undercover because I needed to see the truth for myself. What I saw was unacceptable. This hotel isn't failing because of bad employees. It's failing because of bad leadership." A ripple of murmurs spread through the group. Some looked stunned. Others skeptical. Sophia folded her arms, eyeing him warily. "We've heard promises before," she said bluntly. "Corporations always say they'll fix things, but nothing ever changes." Nathaniel met her gaze. "That's why I'm not asking you to believe me yet. I'm asking you to watch what happens next." He pulled out his phone and tapped a few buttons. First, everyone who was forced into unpaid extra shifts because of Richard's scheduling tactics will be compensated. effective immediately. A few employees exchanged surprised glances. Others let out quiet exhalations, as if they'd been holding their frustration in for too long. I also reviewed the staffing records, Nathaniel continued. There was never a corporate restriction on hiring. Richard made that decision on his own to inflate his performance numbers. That changes now. New staff will be hired immediately, and in the meantime, the corporation is sending in temporary reinforcements. This time, a few heads actually nodded. There was still caution, but also the first flickers of hope. Sophia, still skeptical, asked, "And what about training? We keep getting new hires, but they get thrown into the deep end with no support." Nathaniel nodded. "Good point. Starting tomorrow, we're implementing a structured training process. Veteran employees will also be compensated for mentoring new hires. No more sink-or-swim training." The room was still quiet, but the weight in the air had shifted. It wasn't a relief, not yet, but for the first time in a long while, it was the possibility of change. The next morning, Nathaniel arrived at the hotel before opening. He wasn't here just to make announcements. He was here to ensure real change happened. Before the first shift began, he gathered the employees in the break room, standing in front of them not as an untouchable CEO, but as someone who had walked in their shoes, even if only for a few days. "Starting today, things change," he said, scanning the room. "I've brought in someone to oversee operations while we search for a permanent hotel manager." He gestured toward the door, where a woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped inside. "This is Margaret Lawson. She's turned around 2 struggling hotel locations in the past, and she's here to do the same for you." Margaret gave them a firm nod. "I don't make empty promises," she said, "but I do make real improvements." The employees exchanged glances, some cautious, some hopeful. Nathaniel could tell they weren't ready to trust so easily, and he didn't blame them. Words meant nothing without action. "That's not the only change," Nathaniel continued. "I've reviewed the payroll records, and everyone who worked unpaid overtime will receive back pay. If you ever work beyond your scheduled hours again, you will be compensated fairly." A few employees visibly relaxed, relief flickering across their faces. But Nathaniel wasn't done. "There's also one more thing," he said. "From now on, every hotel in this chain will have an anonymous reporting system that sends employee concerns directly to corporate leadership. If a manager like Richard ever tries to manipulate you again, you report it, and it will be investigated. No more being ignored." Sophia, always the skeptic, narrowed her eyes. "And what happens if someone retaliates against an employee for speaking up?" Nathaniel's expression hardened. "They'll be fired, immediately." This time, the shift in the room was unmistakable. It wasn't just cautious hope, it was belief. Nathaniel had no illusions that everything was fixed overnight, but with Margaret stepping in, new hiring underway, and policies in place to protect employees, the hotel was on the right path. And this was only the beginning. Nathaniel had 9 more hotels to visit, and this time, he wouldn't just take reports at face value. He'd see the truth with his own eyes. A week later, Nathaniel stood near the hotel lobby, watching the staff as they moved through their shifts. Something had changed. The tension that had once weighed heavily over the hotel was starting to lift. Employees were still busy, but they weren't rushing in a state of quiet panic anymore. There was a rhythm to their work now, a sense of control rather than chaos. At the front desk, Elena Carter stood tall, assisting guests with a genuine, if still cautious, smile. She looked rested for the first time since he arrived. Across the lobby, David Chen laughed as he restocked his cart, and Sophia was calmly handling a guest's request without the usual exasperation. They weren't just surviving the job anymore, they were managing it. Nathaniel turned as Margaret Lawson approached, arms crossed. "It's stabilizing," she said simply. He nodded. "It is, but I need to make sure this happens at every hotel." Margaret tilted her head. "Are you planning to go undercover again?" Nathaniel considered it for a moment. Not the same way, but he knew now that real leadership meant seeing things for himself. "Don't just sit in an office and assume things are working," he said. "I need to see it firsthand." "Regularly." Margaret gave a small approving nod. "If you follow through, it'll make a difference." As Nathaniel looked around, watching his employees take their first steps toward a better workplace, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done yet. One hotel was fixed, 9 more to go, and this time he'd make sure every single one was running the way it should. The story of Nathaniel Pierce teaches a crucial lesson about true leadership and accountability. For years, he had trusted reports and middle management to handle operations, but he learned the hard way that numbers and reports don't tell the full story. People do. By going undercover, he saw firsthand the struggles his employees faced: exhaustion, mistreatment, and a toxic work culture fostered by poor leadership. The biggest takeaway from his experience is that leaders must stay connected to their workforce. It's easy to assume problems stem from employees, but often the real issue starts at the top. In this case, the hotel's failure wasn't because of lazy workers, but a manager who prioritized his own success over the well-being of his team. Nathaniel's decision to fire Richard, implement fair policies, and create an anonymous reporting system ensured that employees' voices would never go unheard again. His biggest realization? Leadership isn't just about running a business. It's about supporting the people who make that business run. By stepping out of his corporate office and into the reality of his employees' world, Nathaniel didn't just fix a broken hotel, he became the leader his company truly needed.